So I want to go over this topic about some form inputs of the checkbox versus the radio because I saw this comment come up in the Vue.js developers Facebook group the other day, and I just wanted to address it because I think it was an interesting subject that some people probably get a little bit hung up on. And I wanted to it's a good opportunity to go over some of the web fundamentals and also a little bit into how you might address these things in Vue. So to get started, the question was about taking a group of checkboxes and making them behave like a radio. So if we have a label element, and we can close that. I'm just working here in Code Sandbox, so it's a little bit easy to follow along. And we can say, let me close that, you can see that a little bit better. And then we have an input of type equals checkbox. And along with that, we have a label that is select me, right? So this is just standard HTML. If we click that, we can check it on and off. And the question was about getting this label to work with multiple, or getting these checkboxes to work where if I select one, it will deselect the other. So if I select this one and now I go and select this one, it should deselect this one like that. So the point that I wanted to get across is assuming that visuals don't matter, then this is actually the behavior, the default browser behavior that you would expect from a radio input, not a checkbox. So to implement that, now you could have some JavaScript that listens to a checked event and then goes to all the other checkboxes, maybe in the same div or in the same form field or field set or whatever, and deselects all the other ones. But what you'll find is that while you can technically achieve that, you end up recreating some of the default browser behavior that's available for something already inherently, which is a radio. On top of that, you're going to be changing some of the semantics of what your form actually says. So this input type checkbox actually tells the browser that this input behaves a certain way. And when you change the default behavior, you're losing some of the semantics in what your form should actually be doing. On top of that, there's some accessibility concerns regarding users that rely on both just keyboards or keyboards with a combination of screen readers or things like that. What I mean by that is if I go and I use my keyboard to navigate around this form, every checkbox that is on the page, regardless whether I have JavaScript or not, or I guess you could technically change this behavior with JavaScript. But the point I'm getting to is that every checkbox is reachable by tabbing to it. The same is not the case for a group of radios. So if we go here and I'll just put a little line break in there so we have some separation, maybe two. Okay, so if we have a group of radios and we give them a value equals radio 1, and this one's going to be value equals radio 2, then what we still want to do is we say type radio, name equals radios, name equals radios. So if we do this, then what we can see is as I tab through this form, I can get to all of the checkboxes, right? Back, forward, back, forward. And if I go to the radio and then I tab again, well, I get out of the form, and I'm going to also, well, let's do this correct, right? This is a form, and that's a form. And at the bottom of the form, we're going to have a button. that says submit. Okay, and let's put another BR and BR. So I have a little bit of space. Cool. So again, if I'm in this form and I tab to the first element, it's going to take me to the first checkbox. And if I tab again, I go to the next checkbox because those are two technically unrelated checkboxes. They could still be part of a field set, so they could still be within a related field, but I can still tab to each one individually, and I can activate it just by pressing the space bar. Oops, cool. Just by pressing the space bar, and that'll turn it on or off. And that's the default expected browser behavior. If I go to the radio, I can select one, and if I hit tab again, you'll notice that I don't go to the next radio. And the reason for that is because they are both part of the same, they both have the same name for the input. So if I want to select a different input, I can tab to the selected one, I can hit left or right, or up or down, and that will switch my selection. And that is the default expected browser behavior for people that are using keyboards. Like myself, for example, if I'm going through a form, it's much faster for me to just use the keyboard to navigate around, and I can select that, and I can select which one of the form radios I want, and then hit the submit button. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to explain a little bit about how the browser expects these native form elements to work, and why it's important to work within what the browser expects and make sure that your HTML is semantic, regardless whether you're using something like Vue for your front-end rendering. It's still important to follow the best practices described in the web standards. It's part of the web standards, so that we keep our forms accessible, we keep our websites and applications semantic, and our browsers know. There's just a lot of benefit that comes from that. On top of that, if I were to try to implement some custom JavaScript to treat checkboxes like a radio, then I have a whole lot of extra work to make sure that it actually behaves like a radio, in that if I tab to it and I hit tab again, if this was a radio, I would expect it to go down to, let's say, radio 1, right? And this is radio 2. So if I were to be on, let's say this is check 1, and this is check 2, and they also need some values, equals checkbox 1, and value equals checkbox 2. Or I guess they don't actually need a value, because they can default to either true or false, or 1 or 0, but they do need a name. Yeah. And then, so yeah, getting back to where we were, we can say, let me do one step further and just say that these are related fields. So I'm going to do a field set, right? Close that off. There we go. Okay, so that is a much more semantic way to place these. These radios don't necessarily need to be in a field set, because they share the same name. And so let's say I wanted to implement this field set to behave like a radio. I could technically have some JavaScript that says, when I click this check 2, find this field set, go through all of the other checkboxes in it, and uncheck all of the ones that are not the one that I just checked. And that would work just fine. However, to implement this in a way that would work in the same way as a radio, I would also have to have some sort of keyboard event listener that if I'm currently on one and I hit tab again, I would expect to go to the input radio 1, but in reality I go to check 2. don't know if you can see that, but if I tab, I still go to check 2, when if this was a radio, I would go to radio 1. This is also a good opportunity for me to say, to share why radio names are so important. Is if we take this off and that re-renders, one thing we're going to see about keyboard navigation is if I tab and I'm on the first check, and then I tab again, I'm on the second check, and I tab again, you see how it went to the first radio? So that actually is not the expected behavior for a group of radio buttons or radio inputs that are related when one is selected. In fact, if one is selected, I should go check 1, check 2, radio 2, and then if I go backwards through the list from submit and I go backwards, I should go to the selected option and then check 2, check 1. So here I do go to radio 2, but that's only because it is selected. And in fact, you see what happened here? Also, another thing is as I select different options, I cannot actually deselect what radio 1 and radio 2 is. So the reason for that is, once again, because they don't actually have a name. When it has a name, it knows which value to currently select. It also knows which value to navigate to with the keyboard. So that was just a quick little explainer on some of the little nuances with form markup, accessibility, semantics, when to use one or the other, things like that. So something else I'm going to get into that comes up quite often is you might see people trying to style these checkboxes or radio little UI elements. And well, the truth is that you cannot style those. These are going to be different across every browser, but every browser is going to implement their own unique styles for checkboxes and radios. So you can't style them. So what are the options? Well, you could use something like a div or some other sort of component or HTML tag, and then put some custom styles on it. And that works fine. But once again, you run into the issue that, yes, if you take a div and put an event handler on it, or event listener for the click event, yes, you can technically give it some styles that will make it look like it's checked or unchecked or whatever. But once again, you run into the problem of all of a sudden it's not accessible by keyboard navigation, right? And that's something that I notice a lot, because I actually use my keyboard a lot when I'm filling out forms, is that these custom these custom UI components for checkboxes and radios are not actually, like, I can't actually get to them without the mouse. So we're going to look into how you can implement some more accessible patterns around these things. The first thing I'm going to show is this, hiding these, right? So if we go down to our styles, and we have some default styles, and we'll get to that in a minute. But let's say I took every input with the type equals radio, and every input with a type equals checkbox. And I just said display is none. None. Okay, so this is good. I've hidden my UI, right? And what I can do now is I can take those and I can say, well, if we have a label and we have some input and we have some text, well, we can take the label. The label is outside of the input. So what are we going to do? Well, one thing we can do is we can put a little span and a closing span. And I'm going to copy that, paste it there. And I'm actually going to paste it there as well. And this is going to be radio 1, radio 2. This is going to be check 1, check to copy that, paste there, and make that a 2, right? So now I've got my spans. And what I can do is I can say for each of these, we're going to hide the little UI for it. And we're going to say, let's see if I can do, no, I probably can't do that. So we're going to stick with regular CSS. We're going to say these guys, bring them down here. I'm going to put it on its own line. And we're going to say this guy, and then with a span, and before, no, the span itself, yeah, we'll do before the span, and the same for the checkbox. We're going to say content is just an empty thing. I'm going to give it a border of 1 pixel solid. I'm going to give it a width of 0.5 m maybe, and a height of 0.5 n. And what do we got there? We also need a display property of inline block. Cool. So now I've got my little custom UI elements that I can say that I can start to play around with. So what are the issues that we have here is, well, first off, some of you that might know accessibility a little better are probably screaming at me for putting this display none. So one thing that we've done here is by hiding these inputs, we've effectively killed the keyboard navigation, right? Because although it's hidden, and it's still part of the form, although it's hidden, if I try to tab to it, I can't actually reach it because display none prevents it from, or removes it from the flow of keyboard navigation. So one thing that we have is if you go to allyproject.org or just Google it, you can find this visually hidden class. It's a nice CSS helper tool that you can put on any component that you want to be still accessible within the DOM, within the flow of the page, but not actually visible. So we're going to undo that change, bring back our inputs, and we're going to give the ones that we want to hide a class of visually hidden. And as you can see, as I make these changes over there on the right, they'll start to kind of pop off one at a time. And now what we can do is, as I tab to each of the inputs, you can't see them, but there you go. You see how the submit just lit up? So if I tab back, I'm on one of the 2 radios, whichever one is selected. And if I tab back, now I'm on check 2, presumably. If I tab back one more time, I'm on check 1. Tab forward, check 2. Tab forward, one of the radios. Tab forward, I should be on the submit. And there it is. So if I had a screen reader going on, you would probably hear, this is a radio input, one of them is selected, blah, blah, blah. It has the label of check 2 or the label of check or radio 2 or radio 1 and all that. So with this pattern, we get to keep our accessibility in mind and our keyboard navigation for any users that prefer keyboard navigation, like myself when filling out forms. But we also don't have to rely on the default UI. So let's continue. It's like, now if I want to check this checkbox 1, well, that's great. It's accessible and it's checking on and off as I click, but it's not actually showing me that it's clicked, right? So let's fix that. First of all, let me also fix these radios. If I go here, I know that the expected UI from a radio is to be round. So we can say border radius is 50%. That should make those round. Cool. So now I've got some custom checkboxes, some custom radios. I think I'm going to make these a little bit bigger. Let's go 0.7, 0.7. All right, some fatty ones. Perfect. And maybe give those like a margin right of 0.2 ems. Cool. That's looking good. So now what we can do is first I need to check whether it is selected or not. And what I can do is I can go ahead and copy this line really quick. And I can say, well, if an input with the type of radio is checked, or an input with the type of checkbox is checked, and then the very next element is a span, and we use the before pseudo selector, I can say background color of red. Why not? And you see how these just turned on really quick? So that makes it really easy for me to now be able to turn these on and off. I can hit the checkbox just as expected, and I can hit the radio and it works just as expected. I can also use my keyboard navigation, turn those on and off, and I can use my keyboard on the radio, and then I can hit submit. And that is great. So now we're getting kind of the best of every world for semantics and accessibility and keyboard navigation and custom UI, and the design looks good. I mean, sort of good enough. I'll leave it up to you to design them exactly how you would want. But there's one thing missing, and that is if you see when I'm hovering on this submit button, that is telling me that this is the current item in focus. And if I tab back, I know that I'm on the radios. And if I had a screen reader, it wouldn't be a problem because it would tell me that I'm on the radios. But for a user like myself, I need some help. Like I'm relying on my vision to tell me, where I'm at in this form. And currently, I don't know. If I hit space, okay, I know that I was on check 2. And if I hit, back tab or shift tab, I imagine I'm on check 1. Okay, cool. So that's great for, me kind of knowing where I am, but we can do better. And how we're going to do that is, once again, let's kind of copy this same pattern that we're doing. This becomes a lot easier if you're using Sass. But okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to say we can't put a focus. Well, we could put a focus on the span, right? So we could say tab index of 0. That's going to mean that as I tab through, let's experiment with this really quick. As I tab through, so let's erase all that. And let's say we have a span with a focus state, and we'll target the before. We're going to give this an outline of one pixel solid, I don't know, black. Actually, we'll go 1 pixel dotted black. Yeah. So now, if I tab through, we can see that my input. Well, I guess I don't even need this, because what's going to happen is as I tab through, I can see that now my span is selected. But what's going on is, I can hit the space bar, but it doesn't do anything. And if I hit tab, my focus ring goes away, and if I hit the space bar, now I'm selecting. So what's happening here is I'm focusing on the visually hidden input. Well, let's go back. So right now I'm focusing on the visually hidden input. I hit tab again, and because I'm using a tab index of 0, this now is going to accept focus from the keyboard. This is the span, and now it's going to be focused, but the span doesn't have a default way of handling. It's not going to say, well, if you hit the space bar on me, I'm going to select the checkbox or the radio, right? So if we hit spacebar, enter doesn't do anything. So we can use some JavaScript, and we can listen to key down events on the span, find the input right before it or the label above it, and find the input inside of that, and select that. And that's slightly better than what we had before, or what we were thinking about doing before with the checkboxes trying to behave like radios. This is still more semantic and still relatively easy to do. We are navigating, but another problem here you can see is now I need to tab twice to get to each element. So that is not the solution that I'm really interested in. So we're going to undo that. And instead what we can do is, what I was doing before is just kind of like going along with this same pattern. We're still going to use the focus state, so we can get rid of this guy. We're going to say when this radio is focused, or when this checkbox is focused, go to the sibling span, right? The sibling being they both share the same parent, and we're going to go from the input when it receives focus. We're going to go to the very next sibling, which is a span, and we're going to get the before pseudo selector, and we're going to give it an outline of 1 pixel dotted black. And this can be anything. There's actually ways to get the default browser outline if you're interested in that, or if you prefer having your brand styles, like maybe your brand style is blue or green or whatever, and you want like a 3 pixel solid, I don't know, what's a random color? Dark cyan, sure, why not? If that's the case, so now we can say, if I tab through, you can see how now I can totally see where I'm at. And sure, that submit button is not doesn't match the styles, but that's easy enough to fix. But now what we can do is, tap through, and we get the same behavior that the browser was expecting, and we have our custom UI components, which in this case, probably don't look great, but this is just the foundational work that you can go off and build just about anything you want, and you still get keyboard navigation. I'm not using the mouse for any of this, and you can keep your forms looking beautiful, telling the browser exactly what semantically they represent, telling screen readers exactly semantically what they represent, and allowing keyboard users or users that use the keyboard for navigation to get around and not be hindered by markup that is not what it's intended. So that is my spiel on checkboxes versus radios, and how to implement custom ones, and how to keep everything semantic and accessible. I hope that's helpful to you all. One last thing that I want to end with is answering kind of the question of being able to set your form values or do things in Vue. So the way that I would probably do that is have a data function that returns an object, and it's going to be checkbox 1 is going to be false by default. Checkbox 2 is going to be false by default. And then radios is going to be string that's R1. All right, and we've got a problem here because I missed a comma. And then we can see that, let's see, how about just before the form and just under here, we're going to actually see our binded data. We'll say this, I think I'm actually going to wrap in an object and say inputs is an object with all of these data properties. Put that over so that we can say, throw out a little pre-tag, and then we can just throw out into the DOM our inputs. Right, so now we can see that our checkbox 1 is false, checkbox 2 is false, radios is set to R1, which is going to be the radio 1. And now I need to actually hook those up to my form components. So on the checkbox 1, I can say vModel equals checkbox 1. And I can say the same for checkbox 2. And then I can say the same for this, and this is going to be radios. And then I can say the same for that. So these two have to match because they are the same value, I believe. And because we are passing in value through vModel, we no longer I think we do need the value there. So radios should be that. All right, let me look this up really quick and come back. I figured out what I was doing wrong. Everything was almost right except that I didn't bind to the actual inputs object. So we go inputs.radios and inputs.radios. And now that I've changed that, you can see that because this is R1, it's selected. And if I checkbox 1, actually, you know what? Let me do this without the mouse. If we go through keyboard navigate, checkbox, oops, I hit enter instead of space. If we checkbox 1 with the space bar, we can see that those values are changing. And then if we go to the radio, we can see that because it's bound through vModel, changing those will change our little value down here. So that is all I have. I hope that this was helpful for those of you that are either learning or getting started with Vue or interested in semantic markup or accessibility, or any of you that are contributing to the web platform. Hope this was helpful. Please let me know. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And that's it for tonight.